I'm hoping that my notes will pop up again, but they haven't so far. Okay. So what I'm going to cover today, and I want to talk about is why I suppose I'm covering influence and negotiating in the first place, why they might pop up in your interviews, why they're important to employers. So I want to explain the difference between what influencing and negotiating is. And of course, you'll already know a good deal, about that already, but I want to give you some terminology and a bit of a framework around them. So then we will go on to cover influence and negotiating skills separately and how to talk about them at interview. So again, some words, some jargon to use that you might want to use appropriately at interview. And then we will look at some sample interview questions. So many moons ago, when I was your age, the word influencer was just not in anyone's vocabulary. Of course, there were people who influenced others, there always have been, but it didn't exist as a job title or as a job to aspire to. Now, this session is not about making you all social media influencers, but it is worth acknowledging, I think, that those skills that make some YouTubers very popular, very well paid, and indeed very influential are also the skills that are valuable to you in just about any work situation. So, it's worth recognizing that as well, even if you're not aiming to be a social media influencer. Nor will this session make you into a mergers and acquisitions genius or a hostage negotiator. It's not that sort of session, okay? We're just going to be looking at the basics and to get you thinking about how you already use your skills to influence and possibly negotiate as well. So sometimes you're already doing the things really well, but you just need to know that influencing is one of the labels that you can put on them. Okay, so you might already be doing it, but you might not recognize that that is what you're actually doing. So influence and negotiating are both simply forms of communication. Okay, so in an interview, you might get asked about how your communication skills, how you work, how good it is, or you might get asked about dealing with difficult people, working with teams, dealing with customers. And all of those things will involve influencing skills. So if you've done any sort of work dealing with customers or working in teams, then you probably already have some experience of it, but you might not recognize it as that. So that's something to reflect on and consider where you've got your experience from. So you might not get asked specifically about influencing, but that's likely to come into your answer. Posts where you will be working with customers or clients, posts where you'd be leading a team or indeed working in a team, certainly selling, managing projects, etc. You may be asked questions around how you influence others because those things, are those type of roles are roles where influencing is very important. So first things first then, what is the difference between influencing and negotiating? Let's look at a couple of definitions and take it from there. So influencing the action or process of producing effects on the actions, behaviours, opinions, etc. of another or of others. Okay, so basically something that you do will have an effect on other people's behaviours. Negotiation then is a discussion intended to produce an agreement. And it is that agreement that is important here because there has to be something that can be traded between the two parties. So negotiation is actually one form of influencing. Influencing is kind of the bigger term here. And negotiation is just one aspect of it. So you're more likely to get asked about influencing than negotiation because, as I said, it is a bigger term. But sometimes you get asked questions and the terms might be used quite interchangeably. So I want you to be clear on what the difference is, but also to be comfortable with how you might be using the terms in your interviews. So depending on the jobs that you're going for, it's more likely that you'll be asked about situations where you influenced others. I'll just get that out of the way. But if you have an example of a negotiation, then that's a good example of influencing others as well. So more likely to be asked about influencing, but negotiation is part of that. And certainly if you have an example of that, a great way to be able to put your examples in there. So how do you know if you should be influencing or if you should be negotiating? Here are a few little scenarios that I've put together, and I just want you to think about whether you would negotiate in that situation, or is it purely an influence situation? So the first scenario, you're managing a small team of machine operators. A new piece of legislation has come in that says all machine operators must wear safety goggles while operating the machines. So is that something that as a manager you would negotiate with, or is it something that you would impose or instruct? And for me, the answer is impose or instruct. There's really no choice here. It's legislated for and people's safety is involved, so there's really no negotiation. Also, you're in a position of authority here, so it's up to you to impose it. So the second one then, you're in charge of a small office-based team and the fire alarm goes off. So what do you do? And obviously, no option for negotiating there. So this is time, in this occasion, it's a safety issue, but it's also an extra element of urgency involved there. So there's no time for negotiation, even if it was an option. So it's very much an instruct and impose again. And then finally, and because we haven't used it, you're going to think, well, this one's going to be negotiation, and you'd be right. You need to change your team's working hours to drive customer service, to drive customer service improvements as part of the company efficiency plan. And the answer to that one would be, would you impose it? Would you negotiate? And in this case, I would say negotiate. Now, in this case, you still have authority. Perhaps technically you could just impose what you want. And we'll look at, a little at the sort of influence that you might naturally tend towards. You might not be the sort of manager that likes to negotiate. You might like to keep more control than that. But in this situation, you want to improve customer service. And you need your team to be on board with that. You need them to be able to help you to do that. The team also has some power here. So if you impose, what you might actually do is you might lose out by having a disgruntled team that's not going to help in any customer care efforts. So you really want to gain the consent of the team. Both yourself and the team will have a positive interest in making the decision work for both of you. And you also have to consider the long-term impact of imposing a decision like this on the team. So the long-term relationship could be damaged, and then it's much harder to get anything else done. Okay, so just a couple of examples to get you thinking about whether it's an influencing, an imposing situation or a negotiate situation. So moving on then. So you negotiate when the benefits make it worthwhile, when you need the consent of others, when both parties have something to trade, and that's often important, when neither party has the ultimate power to force a decision. And I want to remind you here that negotiation is just one form of influencing. And you might be asked in your interview about persuading, effective communication, disagreements, working with different communication styles, maybe pitching your ideas, arguing your case. All of those things are around how you influence others. So again, think widely about your examples. And just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, just to pop them into the chat. I'm happy to take questions as we go along or wait until the end. So when we looked at those scenarios, you could see that there were different styles of influence there. And generally, they're divided into what we call push and pull styles. So if I'm going to use the push style, I'll basically be coming from what is on my agenda and directing others as to what is to be done. Okay, so I'm pushing towards that. I'll probably back it up with facts such as the safety legislation, but the chances are that others might feel a bit put out by this. You know, there'll be some people who will not like it that I'm imposing that on them. People generally don't like being told what to do. Hence, you're backing it up with the reasons behind it. Okay. So you're going to use this push style when you have the authority. It might be a time-sensitive situation. You know, it might not be a fire like in our scenario, but it might be to meet a deadline or a decision that has to be made quickly. There may only be one solution. Perhaps the choice has already gone and the decision made. And the intention would be that when people have to comply, the commitment will come after that, basically. So if I'm made to wear safety goggles, I get used to it and I begin to see the benefit of it. So it's, you know, it's not entirely wrong or anything that it's a push situation. It's just looking at what is the situation and what is the best one to use in that scenario. Pull then is very different because now I'm going to you to find out what your agenda is. I'm not coming from what my agenda is all the time. I'm looking at what agenda you have as well. Where are you coming from on this? So rather than impose my agenda, I'm asking what your wants are and trying to deal with your concerns and your motivation, etc. So if the decision is coming from the team, then they tend to feel supported rather than defensive. And that's, as a manager, obviously, you'll want to avoid your team feeling very defensive and put upon. And again, some reasons that you might use pull rather than push would be because there's more than one option. A quick decision isn't needed. A quick decision isn't needed. You can begin a context and a vision around it. It gets people thinking and coming up with ideas. So it might be things that, you know, you might have originally been thinking of pushing people towards, but there might actually be better ideas coming from the team than what you had thought about. So good ideas coming up whenever it's a group decision. And also there tends to be much more of a commitment to it if the actions have come from the group. So now we've covered why you might negotiate rather than use other forms of influence. And we've looked at why you might use one style over another. So if you were asked why you tried to persuade people in a certain way, there might be some things here that might help you in your reasoning. For example, there was no time for collaboration. I didn't have any authority over the group. I thought it would be a good way to get others to think around the problem, that sort of thing. So you might be able to think of times when that actually was the case and whenever you did use your influence in those situations. So hopefully that will be helpful for you in thinking of your own experiences and your own situations. Now, I said earlier that we tend to lean towards a particular style of influencing others. You might be someone who's very comfortable telling others what to do rather than asking them what should be done. So I thought I'd give you a little bit more information about influencing styles. I'm not going to spend long on it, but I will include some more information in the slides as a PDF. So I'll go through them, but you'll get a bit more information in the PDF. So you can have a read up on that there. But just to give you a little bit of information on it, people tend to use just 6 main channels of persuading or influencing other people at work. And I think it's worth having a look at them because you're likely to be drawn to a certain style because of your character. But it may be that there will be times when another influencing style might be better for you. So you don't always use the same style. That's why I'm not giving you a questionnaire to say, yes, and that's you, okay? You can flex between these styles. So it's worth knowing what they are, maybe knowing what you would naturally tend to go towards, but remembering that you can flex between these styles, especially if you're aware of them and you're aware of the differences between them and the advantages of some of them. So the 6 main styles then, or channels, are authority, rationality, vision, relationships, interests, and politics. Now, you might already be drawn to one of them just through the words themselves thought, yeah, I would probably go down the rationality route. That sounds like me. But let's have a closer look at what they actually do mean. So authority then is the most commonly used influencing tool in work settings, and it's often used because of the hierarchical setup in most work settings. But it's also used because of a requirement to adhere to policies or procedures or regulations and standards. So if you're using your position of power or stating the rules, then it's probably an authority style that you're using. And this style is most effective when you accompany it with justifications and explanations which give people some assurances. The second one, the rationality channel, then relies on data and logic to influence others. This one does not use a formal hierarchy, so it's often used with peer-to-peer influence or even bottom-up influence. For this style, you really need to have an audience who's willing to listen. That's the important bit. The audience is willing to listen because remember, you have no authority over them. They're likely to engage in debate. One person's rationale isn't the same as another's because people will look at things, at the same thing, with the same information with a different set of eyes based on their own needs and their own biases. So it works best when you present the evidence and encourage people to apply their own judgment and experience in order to draw their own conclusions. Okay, and again, that will be in the PDF for you. The vision channel then is all about inspiring and appealing to the emotions. You can see how different that is to the previous channel there. It might be around shared purposes, it might be around hopes or fears or dreams. If this is the way that you like to persuade, then you might do it more with telling stories and using images that appeal to people's feelings, their beliefs, maybe their cultural ties or their life experiences. And this is likely to make people feel that this is the sort of person I want to be. Just as the visuals on Instagram or Pinterest make us all think, oh, that's the sort of house I want or the sort of wardrobe I want, whatever it might be. So you're creating the vision for someone. So a different style of influencing. And the next type then is around relationships. This is built around the fact that we're more likely to say yes to people that we know and like. So it's about building trust and credibility with people in order to be more liked and to be more trusted. Okay, so it's all about the relationships with that style. The interest channel is about using interests, and we're not talking about people's hobbies here. It's about the other person's needs and incentives and using that knowledge as a way of persuading others so as to get things done. It's very often used in negotiation. It's about finding out what the other person's interest is in the situation. What do they need to get from it? And then you're basically looking at trading on those needs. It might be something as basic as asking for a favor and using something that you know that the other person needs as a way of getting them to say yes to it. Okay, so maybe more of a negotiation style there whenever you're using the interests channel. And then the final influencing channel is the politics channel. Now, when someone says politics to me, I immediately think of the news and politicians and government. But you know, there's politics in a lot of things. You know, the term office politics, if you don't know it now, whenever you go out to work, you certainly will. So this is about recognizing and working with the formal and the informal sources of power and the decision-making processes that are already in place. So if you're someone who uses this channel, then you're probably someone who pays a lot of attention to social networks that have some power and influence. You know how to form coalitions and you're competent at gaining access to key decision makers. You might not use those terms of coalitions, key decision makers, or anything, but you know who's in the know. You know who it is that you want to befriend and influence, and that's using that politics channel. You know how the organization works, how the decision making process works, and you know the right contacts to make and the right buttons to push. This one does require you to be a very skilled communicator and to have a good understanding of your environment. If you get it wrong, then you can come across as very scheming. So where in those six is your natural fit, I suppose? It's useful to have some of that knowledge, because if you're answering a question on influencing, then it's good to be able to say how you influenced, what skills did you use, how did you go about deciding how to influence. And I'd also say that you can combine these styles. You don't have to use just the one. You can use one way and then move on to another if the first way doesn't work. You can use the relationship style and build up a degree of trust, for example, and also use the vision style. They're not exclusive of each other. And when you're talking about these things at interview, you don't have to name the styles. You're not going to say, I use the relationship channel as my style of influencing. But you might say, well, I try to get to know people and build a relationship with them so that they understand me and that they can trust me. It's just to give you an idea of how you influence. And as I said, I'll include some more detail on each of these in the handout. So it's worth noting that if you go back to that idea of push-pull influence, the first three channels, so the authority, the rationality, and the vision channel, would all be in that sort of push scenario. And the relationship, interests, and politics channel would all be in the pull. So again, just a wee bit more detail on that. Okay, so I want to go do a little bit more on negotiation. And I just want to give you a few little, I suppose, nuggets of information. So remember, negotiation is only one form of influencing. And I've already given you some reasons as to why you might negotiate rather than choose another form of influence. Needing consent, not having authority, that sort of thing. And I think it's really important to understand that not everyone approaches negotiations in the same way. Some people will approach it with the intention that they will emerge the winners and the others the losers. And that's important for how you prepare for a negotiation. But that's not really the ethos behind negotiations. The intention should be that it's a win-win situation. Both parties come out with a satisfactory outcome. It's not always the case by any means, but if you at least go into negotiations hoping that it will be a win-win rather than a win-lose or indeed a lose-lose situation. Well, nobody goes into negotiations hoping for that outcome. Okay, so a little story of negotiation then, and this is a story about two teenagers and an orange. There's the orange and there's the teenagers. And quite, whenever I put this together, I was thinking then afterwards, I actually don't know if Bart and Lisa are teenagers. I have no idea what age they are. And certainly they've been on the go for a long time, that they're certainly not teenagers anymore, but that's who I'm using at the moment. So here's the orange, here's the teenagers. So there's one orange left in the fruit bowl, and Bart and Lisa both want it. As you can imagine, when these two both want something, things can quickly become, the situation can quickly become a bit difficult. So Mum Marge steps in and says, okay, you both want the orange, but there's only one orange and you can't both have it. So here's what we're going to do. Bart, you're going to cut the orange in half. And of course, at this point, Bart will no doubt be sniggering and plan to cut the orange unevenly. And Marge says, and Lisa, you are going to choose which half you want. So we've got the orange cut in half. But in order to have a satisfactory negotiation, there has to be an element of choice for the participants. And also they have to feel that the solution is equitable and fair. So Bart and Lisa have now got half an orange each, and they realize that this is fair and that they've had some choice in it. So it's a win-win situation. Okay. So are they happy? Well, Bart, he goes off and he eats his half of the orange and throws away the peel. And it turns out that he had been pretty hungry, and that's why he wanted the orange. And after eating only half of the orange, he's still hungry. So he's not all that happy at all. And Lisa, she goes off and she peels the orange, or her half of the orange, and she puts the flesh in the bin because she just wanted the peel of the orange to flavour a cake that she was making. And it turns out not to be a very tasty cake because she needed the peel of a whole orange, not half an orange. So she's not that happy either. So while it may have been a fair solution and a win-win solution in terms of it being there being choice and them both having, some of the orange, it certainly wasn't the optimal solution. And all it would have taken was a little bit more information. So someone to say, what do you actually want the orange for? What is your interest in this orange? And the solution would have been entirely different, with both Lisa and Bart entirely happy with the solution. So it's a really simple story. And by the way, there are loads of videos on YouTube to illustrate it. But it's a simple story which I think really illustrates that before you can really get to a solution that really works for both people or for both parties, you have to know what each person really wants, not just what they're asking for or indeed demanding. So there has to be talking, there has to be good questioning and research, and there really has to be listening. So think about how you can demonstrate those skills whenever you're talking about influencing or negotiating. And always be looking for that optimal solution and what you might need to get you to the optimal solution. So you really should try not to go into negotiation without preparation, and you want to plan your strategy. How are you going to approach it? What language will you use? If someone comes in and says, hello, loser, then you have a pretty good idea about what their style is going to be. So the language is important. How you actually start to broach the subject is important. You have to be really clear about what it is that you really want from the negotiation, and then prioritize those wants in terms of what you can trade and what you can't trade. Make sure to keep an open mind. You don't know what way the negotiation will go until it actually happens. So make sure to be fair and remember that you're there because both of you have wants, and you have to respect the wants of the other party as well. And go into the negotiation with the knowledge that there will be compromise on both sides. Be prepared to trade, but know what you're willing to trade and what you're willing to compromise on. So again, just some extra thoughts there in terms of preparing for negotiation. So when it comes to the actual process of negotiation, I thought I'd give you just one simple process called the WANTS method by Professor Gavin Kennedy. And this method focuses on the 4 phases that are common to all negotiations. It's a good way to be, I suppose, adequately prepared. It's worth noting that the stages don't necessarily follow in order because, for example, you might find that you haven't prepared well enough. You maybe didn't have all of the information, and you maybe have to go back a step, go back to the previous phase to do more preparation, for example. So the 4 phases then are prepare, debate, propose, and bargain. And within those 4 phases, you'll cover what do we want, what do they want, what wants could we trade, where you are maybe giving proposals, what wants will we trade in the bargaining phase, and hopefully you get to the do we have a deal stage. So just 4 phases there. something again, just a short summary to keep in mind if you're actually thinking about negotiations, having to talk about negotiations, or just indeed influence in interviews and in other situations as well. Might be the sort of thing that you do as team challenges or in assessment centres and things too. So a few general pointers then. Establish your credibility, because people will want to know that you have the right to be in that situation negotiating. You might even have professional qualifications around the subject. Don't necessarily mean a negotiation, but if you're there trying to sell something, or you're there talking about environmental issues or something like that, what's your credibility around that? So it could be professional qualifications, could be experience. Be likable. As I said, people will respond more to people that they like. So smile, remember names, and use people's names. You can use subtle compliments like, I see you've done your research on this. Spend time setting out and explaining your starting position. Argue your case with logic, having done your research. Use positive rather than negative language. And I think that's important for any sort of influencing that you're trying to do, to try and keep things, in a positive way. So think about the language that you're going to use. Search for common ground. Listen and do not interrupt. Clarify issues and seek further justification if you think that their logic might be flawed. Um, Understand maybe any outside forces that might be affecting the problem. Might be things that you don't have any control over, but it has an impact on what the problem might be. If you need more thinking time or perhaps some cooling off time, then use adjournments. Say, just need to take a few moments here, try and keep calm. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that you need to continually tell yourself as you go through any sort of influencing or negotiating. Okay, so just a few wee sort of phrases and things to think about whenever you're influencing or negotiating. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the interview questions themselves. So I think now would be a good time just to check in with you, see if there are any questions.
Hi, Roshi. No questions have come in.
Okay. Folks, still time to put in questions into the chat if there's anything there that you want further explained. I'm not sure that I can give you an awful lot more, but just if there's something that doesn't make sense to you or anything like that. So I'll move on then just to the interview type questions and that. And I always start off by telling you that, just a reminder, I suppose, just in terms of using the STAR technique for effectively answering your interview questions. So basically, you want to be able to tell the interviewer your story by putting your answer into context for them. Remember that they've probably asked the same question to quite a few interviewees, possibly on that same day. So you don't want to make it hard for them. You want to make your answers nice and clear and logical and answering the actual question that they're asking you. So putting it into context for them is a good start. So when you're formulating your answer for your interview, and do this obviously whenever you're writing out your practice questions, whenever you're preparing for your interview, but even if you're doing it as a question that you have never thought of before and you're having to think of it on your feet as well, use the STAR technique because it does make things clearer and more logical, and it means that you get your main points across. So start by listening to the question, think of the example that you're going to use. As I say, hopefully you'll have already prepared it. Frame your answer into situation, task, action, and result. Describe the event or the situation that you were in. Explain the task that you had to complete. What were the challenges? Describe the specific actions that you personally took to complete the task. And you can say that, what you did as a team, but you should also say what you personally did because you're the person being interviewed. Finish with the results. What was the results of your actions? Were there benefits? Were there cost cuttings? What was the impact of it? Okay, and I also just want to remind you too, And if you haven't heard of it, one of the things that we want to make you aware of is the software that we have available to you to practice interviews. It's called ShortlistMe. Patricia will put the link into the chat for me and a PDF just on how to use it and that. But you can also find it on the careers website. And it's a software package that provides interviews for specific companies like Virgin Media, AstraZeneca, the NHS, lots of companies, maybe probably 20, 30 or so. But it also provides a chance to interview for different types of roles, such as law or banking or engineering, etc. There's a broad range of opportunities for you to practice your interviews on it. Once you register, you're in control of when you actually interview, but you only have 3 days to complete the interview at that time. Choose a time that suits you, knowing that you're only going to have 3 days to complete it. Now, you're not actually interacting with a real life person, so there's nothing to be wary of, nothing to feel embarrassed about or anything. You will be responding to pre-recorded questions as if it was an online interview. So you get some time to prepare your answer and then you give your answer. 5 or 6 questions, I think it is, per interview. And the important thing is that you then get some feedback on how you did. Again, it's automated feedback, so you're not interacting with anyone, but it is a good interactive quality experience. So again, I think Patricia's already put that link into the chat. Do go ahead and make the most of it. It's good to be able to do the practice for interviews, and some of the interviews these days are certainly still online, so it's good to have that practice as well. So moving on to just sample interview questions. And I've 2 pages of interview questions today. Normally in these sessions, I only put up 1 page, and this is even quite small writing here. I've 2 pages of interview questions because there are a lot of questions in different sort of styles that you can get asked on influencing and negotiating. Now, you'll notice that on this first page, the words influence or negotiate are not even used, but the skills are exactly what we've been looking at today. So, all right, the word influencing isn't there, but you'll have things like persuade or communicate effectively, that sort of thing. So the questions then, tell me about a time when you have persuaded someone else to do something that they didn't want to do. Tell me about a time when you had a disagreement with a team member. How did you overcome it? Again, remember when you're answering any of these things to, certainly if you've prepared it, try and use positive language all the time. So, the term disagreement might be quite negative, but how you respond to it should be in positive language, okay? Tell me about a time when you had to bring others round to your way of thinking. That's a definite influencing. Tell me about a time when you had to communicate effectively. Tell me about a time when you had to change your communication style for different audiences. And that sort of thing can come up quite regularly. What would you do if a client disagreed with you on the best action to take? And you could change that into what would you do if a team member or something like that too. What would you do if a customer complained? If you were managing a team, how would you persuade them to accept an unpopular decision? So you can talk about the different styles, the different approaches that you would take there in terms of how you would influence them. If you were managing a team, how would you work with and command respect from team members who are more experienced than you? And again, influencing some of the things there about influencing and not necessarily negotiating there, but how to get them to respect you in terms of those things that I'd said to you about making sure that you're credible, that you're likable, that you're respecting them, all of those sort of things as well. Second page then is mostly about negotiation. So can you tell me about a time you failed to reach an agreement in negotiations? How do you plan for negotiations? Why is endurance and persistence important in negotiations? Can you give me an example of a time you used silence as a communication technique? Why is it important to understand the other side's needs in negotiations? How do you establish rapport and trust? Why is it important? Have you resolved a conflict? Can you give me an example of that? So remember, put your answers into that STAR framework. Position your response in a positive way, even if the change was not entirely successful or even if it was uncomfortable for you. Try and make sure that your language around this is always about, positive and positive outcomes and that. Okay, folks, so other than a few reminders for sessions coming up, that is pretty much me. So if you've got any questions, or Patricia, if there's anything that you would like to add around those interview questions or the topic itself.
Roshi, no questions have come in, and the only thing I was going to say is about those questions around negotiation. They might seem a little bit daunting to some students because you might be thinking you haven't had times when you have negotiated these big deals with clients that you can give as examples. So really what you can use for this are, group work exercises at university. It doesn't have to be a big deal that you're talking about here when it comes to an example. So when you're talking about agreement and negotiations, it could simply be about how you divided work among your group when you were in a group work exercise. So don't be too daunted by the word negotiation here. And as Roshan said, try to think beneath it into the different communication styles that you would be using for that. So your examples really can come from anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And, I was a wee bit reluctant even to put those up because I know that, negotiation isn't likely to come up too often at interview. It depends on what the job itself is that you're going for. It's more likely to be that first page of influencing skills. But I'm also very conscious as well that students are using these skills all the time in exactly the sort of examples that Patricia's talking about there and those sort of group exercises and things. But unless you actually reflect on it and acknowledge those skills for the type of things that they are, then you don't realize that that's the sort of thing you can talk about in an interview. So, if you're in a group work situation and somebody says, no, I'm not working on that, or I disagree with that, or I think we should do it this way instead of this, those are all examples of when influence is taking place, whether it's through them or whether you're doing it. So it's about reflecting on your experiences. You'll all have them. It's just about being able to put that label on them and talk about them at interview.
Yeah, indeed. The other thing I was going to say, it was quite interesting to see the breakdown of the different communication styles or communication channels. And I think, I know we were talking and Roshan was talking about which ones you may be more drawn to at certain times and, different ones, using different ones for different things. And it's also very useful when it comes to negotiation to recognize the preference that the other person has.
Yeah.
And so if you are in some kind of discussion, negotiation with people that you work with, you will come to realize which one that other person tends to prefer, and you can maybe then switch to using that channel. So it's quite a useful thing when you are trying to persuade someone to recognize what their preference is and really work to that.
Yeah. It's sometimes more obvious for things like someone who wants all the facts and figures. I can certainly see that one more readily,
Yeah, it's very,
more so than someone who just wants to discuss what the benefits are, or how it's going to work out, for the company or something like that. But yeah, you can see those changes in people, or the preferences in people if you really think about it. So again, maybe even in your teammates, or maybe in if you've got any sort of part-time jobs and you're working as part of a team or anything in that, you might see those differences as well. It's in the language that they use. It's in the things that they kind of dismiss. I don't want to see the statistics on it. That kind of thing will give you an idea of what their preferences are. So start with your own preference, but you then have to look at other people's as well. So no questions, folks. Have we really covered everything for you?
Well, I've put the slides in to the chat as well as the links to ShortlistMe, and I'm just about to add the feedback form in. But I'm sure there's plenty of more information covered in those slides that PDF. If you do have questions after the session, you can refer back to that.
Yeah. Okay, folks, shall we leave it there then?
Looks like it, Roisin. Okay.
At least stop recording. I wish I'd